should we talk about another bit of a strange mixed bag judgment? This one, actually, the Sandie Peggie tribunal has finally come to an end. So it was found that she had been harassed by her employer, NHS Fife, after she was disciplined when she put in a formal complaint about a male trans-identified colleague changing with her. But the judgment strangely didn't say that women have an automatic right to single-sex spaces. It was quite convoluted, saying that you do if you complain, but not until you complain, which is a bit of an odd thing. I thought that rights were, only meaningful if they're granted. You shouldn't have to demand them, surely.
Exactly, yeah. Joanna Williams' article in Spiked is really great at just outlining what an ordeal this woman's been through.
Oh, God, yeah.
And how absurd it is that it has taken, over 300-page publication to ascertain why it would be wrong that a woman would be made to change in the same space as a man. It's a bit like the sort of the thing around the Supreme Court judgment where you think, this is just nuts that it's had to get to this level to say what everybody knows to be true and normal.
The men have penises and women have vaginas.
Yeah, exactly. But, and you can't overstate what Sandy Peggie has been through. She, from sort of deep scrutiny about her relationship with her daughter, people saying that she was, lying about, having a menstrual flood, which was why she didn't want to change with the male trans-identifying colleague. And again, it's a bit like what we were just talking about, in one breath, they're all sort of women and girls.
Yeah.
Period policies at work, blah, blah, blah. And then the other hand, it's like you lying cow if a woman actually opens her mouth and has an opinion about something. But it is, I think Sandy's case shows how, in a way, flimsy the legal route of combating this is. Because even though you've had Supreme Court judgment, or even though you have sort of, Stonewall being taken out of certain institutions and things like that, it still is the case that the sort of go-to for many of these institutions is to side with the sort of the right on, whether it's trans or whatever else, and to see anyone who has, whether it's a gender critical opinion or anti-Black Lives Matter opinion or whatever it is, as wrong and suspicious, and the one to be sort of investigated rather than the other way around. So, all solidarity to Sandie Peggie, but this was not going to be the last case like this we see. And I don't know whether the answer is to continue having these. The sort of a public legal case is extremely draining on the individual. It's helpful in a way to shine a light on this, but I think there just has to be more kind of, just kind of grassroots normal people pushing back and asking questions and speaking up, because this isn't going to be won through the courts, because as we see, it's incredibly difficult. And it's not like every court has suddenly decided to become gender critical. Far, far from it.
That's true. Even that ringing, clear Supreme Court judgment, which just leaves no room for ambiguity as to the legality of single-sex spaces, is still just being ignored left, right and centre down the country. Yeah. And it's interesting. Sandy Peggie is appealing the verdict, and I think one of the reasons, because quite bizarrely, is that it contains a number of made-up quotes. It quotes, for instance, the Meyer Forstater judgment, which basically enshrined gender-critical beliefs as protected in law, and it does this quote about a hierarchy of rights, which doesn't appear anywhere near in the judgment. It also quotes or misquotes the Asher's Bakery case. Famously the Christian bakers who didn't want to put a pro-gay message on a cake. A complete misquote. So it seems like, the judiciary, even when they made partially a good decision in terms of saying that Sandie Peggie had been harassed, they are a bit of a shambles, actually, and really not the people we can look to for common sense and guidance on these.
No, exactly. I think inevitably it is going to be tested in court again, not just in the form of this appeal, but there was always going to be these kind of subsequent cases which you would hope formalise and fortify the Supreme Court ruling, but in this case seem to have taken a step back. Because the logic of it is torturous. I don't claim to be an expert in the Equality Act and how it interacts with various other pieces of legislation, but that core argument, as you gestured to earlier, Fraser, that essentially it's not unlawful to have a man in a women's space until a woman complains about it, at which point it becomes unlawful for a bit, until maybe you change their rotas around, until they don't have to work with one another, and then it's lawful again. It doesn't make any sense, and it obviously completely undermines what we all took the Supreme Court ruling to mean, which is that sex means sex in the Equality Act, and therefore single-sex spaces flow from that. So, and even the length of this thing, was it 312 pages? I think speaks to how convoluted and confused it was. The fact that it seems to be kind of recycling and airing all of the stupid gender ideology talking points. If you were trying to work out how to balance the rights in this situation, you might take into account how much surgery the person's had, or what they look like. So if they're making a bit more effort, maybe they're allowed in the women's space. It doesn't make, this is stuff that we thought we'd knock back, really. And that's why this isn't going to be the end of the litigation, certainly. And, but also does point to that kind of broader cultural battle which needs to be had out in order to stop these things from ever having to reach a tribunal or what have you. And also the other thing that's in judgment, which is fascinating, is the kind of implicit and explicit victim blaming in relation to Sandie Peggie, the suggestion that she was expressing herself in her exchanges with Beth Upton, the male doctor who identifies as a woman, she was that there are permissible and unpermissible, or there are proper and improper ways in which to express that. I mean, it feels like it's very much kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back over the course of this year where this issue is concerned.
And Ella, it does feel this issue is particularly pertinent to working class women. This is, if you're a middle class professional, you don't have to get changed at your job, for instance, just as one example. And this is just a nurse who's been working in the NHS, doing, giving great service for decades, and just being absolutely put through the ringer for holding a belief that people have held since the beginning of time.
Yeah, well, there's obviously the nurse-doctor dynamic here as well, between Beth and Sandy, which is pretty obvious when you read around it, which individual you'd like to go for a drink with and who's not so very nice. But the thing about it is that there's...
Oh no, lads' weekend, you qualify for that.
We're constantly told that, the kind of the era of be kind politics, that we're told that the main goal of anyone at any time is always to make sure everybody's kind and comfortable. And
safe.
Feels safe and secure in their work and blah blah blah. And it's just you end up sounding like some kind of tub thumping feminist now, because it's just never the case with women in these scenarios. It's whenever there is a clash between trans rights and women's rights, if that's how you want to put it, it's always the woman who is demonized, and it's always the woman who is there's something wrong with her because she's not open to this new world of acceptance.
She needs to be re-educated. I mean, that was what the nurses in Darlington were told. They need to be re-educated to understand why they should change the land.
Because their discomfort, a lack of privacy or dignity, wasn't an actual discomfort. It was just a misunderstanding of what they should feel. And it's hard not to see the sort of, when you pare it back, the realities here, which is men trying to force women to do things that they don't want to do. Now, there are, if you just have clear guidelines, there's endless room for people to make informal arrangements at work. And there's, I'm sure lots of people will do that. I know that there are lots of people across the country who, are fine with certain things, not fine with certain things. But when things clash, as it did between Beth Upton and Sandie Peggie, it's very obvious who holds the power in that dynamic. Unlike Peggie, Upton hasn't had the kind of intense personal scrutiny, disruption in her career, personal stress, all the rest of it that she's had to be put through. And I just think that tells you something about the balance here that needs to be readdressed, because it's not all be kind. It's very much be kind or else.
Yeah. And even this sort of language around competing rights, quite aside from the legal questions therein, doesn't make any sense. Because the reason that women's spaces exist is not to imbue women with a sense that they are women, to validate their identity as women. It's a very kind of clear-cut question of safety, dignity. A lot of these arguments have been aired very well over the course of the past few years, as a lot of very courageous people, primarily women, have been fighting this issue. And yet what we have in this situation is someone who is desperate to use those facilities because it reaffirms their sense of themselves, even though it does not align with biological fact or, frankly, how most of the rest of society happens to see them. You can't reconcile that. You can't reconcile those two claims, those two positions. And it was also interesting reading the judgment and the coverage around it. Again, the recycling of these old canards around, it's not been proven by any a meaningful sense that trans women are a elevated threat to women in women's spaces. This isn't, again, not the point. The reason that you don't allow men into women's changing rooms or bathrooms and so on is not either because all men are this or that all trans-identified men are. It's to say that in a situation like that, you can't tell who is who, and also because of the strength imbalance, because of this and that. It's sort of commonsensical as well as being a very hard one set of rights. So it's a reminder that these things will continue to be fought in court necessarily, it seems like, but also outside of it, because the institutions have always been the problem in terms of enforcing this stuff, even when no one was noticing that these policies were being changed.
And isn't women's just privacy and dignity enough? You don't have to say that, someone is the risk of is necessary.
I think this is a really key point, and something that if it exists to start to splinter now, the gender critical movement needs to take on, because the more you talk about, I've never agreed with the whole sort of slight moral panic around sexual dangers of all the rest of it, because what that does is it takes away it takes away the focus from what most people feel, which is not a risk of or assault, but just a discomfort. It's hard to describe why it feels awkward changing in front of your brother or anyone, any man. It's not to do with feeling physically threatened necessarily. It's just to do with a sense of comradeship between women, of privacy and dignity, or not feeling safe but feeling comfortable.
Yeah.
And I think actually we need to start talking more about, even I think there's scope to talk about why it's positive to have women's spaces and men's spaces, particularly for in schools and teenagers and things like that. There are things that happen in, sex only spaces, which are, not to do with safety, but to do with growing up and learning and chatting. And, I think we need to focus more on why these things are necessary in a sort of for positive reasons rather than in a sort of moral panic way, because the moral panic route leads to bigger problems. And, trans people are not an elevated threat they are a freaking nuisance when they won't get out of your changing room because they want to validate their identity. And that's a sort of a nuanced argument I think we need to get better at making.
And I suppose at the same time, it's also the loophole sort of issue as well. Like because again, it's not to say that people have gone through all of the effort of transitioning or what have you, purely because they've got this nefarious agenda in mind. But as we've seen with Isla Bryce and as we've seen with many of these other horrific situations, there's going to be a non-negligible proportion of people who will just exploit this get out of jail free card, or certainly the golden ticket into the women's space that they otherwise weren't granted. And the naivety in the face of that, again, not enormous, but still, not unimportant level of threat that has been presented by people who the issue of sexual violence is like their totalizing mission has been really, really interesting, from observing this over the past couple of years.